What's up, guys? Welcome back to the caves, and Season 5 for Deep Rock Galactic has officially been out for exactly 2 months now as of this video's recording. So I kind of wanted to do a status update on where this season is exactly standing right now. And I know it seemed a little bit early to be doing something like this, but when Season 4 first came out, we kind of saw the issues and the stuff that was coming with that season very early on. So I kind of wanted to do something similar and see if there's anything going on with this particular season that we're not maybe seeing, and just talk a little bit about how this particular season is going so far, and if the new things that have been implemented are being done in a good way, and if they are being healthy for the game's longevity. Because there's a lot of stuff that came out with this particular season, both big and small, and many people have different opinions about these particular aspects, myself included. So then if you guys are ready, let's talk about Season 5 of Deep Rock Galactic and where it stands right now, as well as if the things that it has added into the game are being received in a good way and if it is healthy for the game. By the way, if you like this video and want to see more, be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss another upload. So first, talking about how this season is going as a whole, I think that this season is leagues above what we saw come out of Season 4. Not because Season 4 was inherently bad, but just because a lot of things that happened regarding Season 4 took so long to get ironed out and put into a position where they were manageable, and Season 5 for the most part came out of the gate already pretty well put together, and the things that it implemented were pretty stable and put together on release. In terms of overall content, this is probably by far the most we have seen in a single season. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is the most that we've seen in a single season, and the amount of ways that missions are adjusted and changed, from enemies to objectives to all things in between. Overall, I think this season has been a very positive change, but each individual aspect needs to be addressed because obviously people have different views about each individual thing that was added in with this particular season. So first, starting off with the biggest and most important thing that was added with this particular season, which is the new mission type, the Deep Scan. This mission type has become one of my new favorites to go through, and I think that they executed the creation of this particular new mission type very well, because it feels like it's a combination of several different mission types, but in a good way. It doesn't feel like they're recycling certain aspects or certain themes from other mission types, but rather they're taking those particular themes and changing them up in a bit of a new way to where there's just more variety for people who like this particular style of mission. In the beginning, when the season first came out, I will say that the early stage of this particular mission was a little bit annoying just because it was really hard to find the crystals in the first place. But now that they have adjusted the actual detection of the crystals themselves and also made it slightly easier to track the crystals when you're far away, the initial stage of this particular mission where you're hunting for the resonant crystals is significantly better, and in turn makes the mission feel like it's dragging a lot less, which was my main complaint when the mission first came out. Other than that though, this mission is phenomenal. The drill elevator section is great. The geode section is beautiful, and I love going down there every time. And the way that you are advancing kind of in a unique way by going down, similar to an escort duty mission, but in a different direction, it kind of lets certain builds and certain stuff that doesn't really get to see a whole lot of play shine a whole lot more. Plus, just seeing all of the enemies come down the tube that you create when you're drilling down is just very satisfying and kind of just makes you feel the presence of what's going on. I think the mission type overall has a very good mix of low intensity and high intensity sections. As I've described it several times, it's kind of like a mixture of egg hunt and escort duty, in that you are trying to find stuff, but then you're also traveling with a piece of equipment as it continues towards its objective, but with the benefit that you don't need to worry about losing the mission because the drill elevator can't be destroyed, and the search part of the mission being a little bit harder because, unlike the eggs, the crystals don't directly show themselves and they're not really easy to see, and instead you have to use a little bit of problem solving and detective work to figure out where they're at. So in summary, I think the Deep Scan mission type has melded perfectly into the Deep Rock Galactic rotation of missions. I think it is a phenomenal addition that has been added to the roster, and it has seamlessly inserted itself to where it feels like it's just sort of always been there. And again, it has become one of my favorite mission types to play, as it is just very fun and very enjoyable. The next biggest thing that was added in with Season 5 that has since been changed around and adjusted to a decent degree are the new enemy types that have been added into the game. There are technically 4 new enemies added into the game, although 3 of them are standard normal enemies and 1 of them is linked to a specific event, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the 3 enemies that we got are, of course, the Glyphid Stalker, the Stealthy Ambushing Bug, the Bartok Scale Ramble, the Stationary Machine Gun that can spew out projectiles at you, and the Barrage Infector, which is basically very similar to the Spitball Infector, except it fires a shotgun of bombs instead of one very large projectile. So to start off, I think that these enemies were a lot better implemented than the Stingtail and Septic Spreader back in Season 4, especially on their initial release. I do think those 2 enemies are now in a much more controlled place and are not nearly as bad as they were at the beginning of Season 4, but I think that these particular enemies started off the season, honestly, a little bit too weak, if I'm going to be honest with you. The Stalker is probably the one exception to this because I felt like the Stalker was relatively durable enough to where I wasn't just deleting it in 2 seconds, and its presence was there. It wasn't like it was just something that I just got rid of very quickly, but especially in the very beginning of the season, the Scale Bramble and the Barrage Infector were very, very easy to take out. Once you take out the Scale Bramble's nodules and expose its core, the core takes like 2 or 3 hits from basically anything to take out. And the Barrage Infector is kind of in a similar way where its weak point is very, very easy to hit, and it really doesn't take a whole lot of firepower to take this thing out. And especially since both of these things are stationary, they can't really pursue you or hurt you too much if you're in a good position. That being said, they have adjusted the stats on them in several hotfixes and patches since the season first came out, and I do think that now they are in a little bit better of a position. They tweaked around some of the damage and cooldown stats. Ultimately, I do think they are still pretty easy to take out, but I would rather have something be a little bit too easy than be incredibly difficult like the Stingtail and Septic Spreader, as I said before. The Glipid Stalker specifically, I think, is probably the best executed enemy that they have had so far this season because it fills a specific role that the bugs didn't really have up until this point, and it does it in a very good way to where I actually feel a little bit of anxiety and stress whenever I hear its call come out, to where I know it's around and I know it's just waiting to ambush somebody, and that I think is the tell of a good design for a creature like this. It is a stealth ambush predator, and once it makes its presence known that it's nearby, you kind of put your head on a swivel and you start to figure out where this thing is because you know it's going to mess you up if you let it. And if it does get the drop on you, it's going to hurt you a lot because it makes you way more vulnerable to any other enemy that's in the area by stopping your shields from coming back, which is a unique effect that we really don't have a whole lot of things that do stuff like that. So I do like that aspect about the Stalker, and its visual design as well is just very gnarly looking and I love it. The Scale Bramble is in a unique situation where I like the way that this enemy is designed and I like the idea of what it wants to do, but again, I just feel like it is just a little bit too easy to get around and too easy to take out. Really, the biggest thing that makes this particular enemy difficult is just where do the nodules spawn. If they spawn in advantageous positions for you, you really don't have much trouble taking this thing out at all. And if they spawn in really bad positions, it's really just an annoyance to get to them, but still not that big of a deal unless there's other things in the area as well. Same thing with the Barrage Infector. It's really not that big of an issue, especially considering the fact that it can't hit you if it doesn't have line of sight. And most of the time, whenever I see these things pop up, my teammates get rid of them before I even have the opportunity to really get in a few shots off, which I guess is a good problem to have. But for creatures that are this big and sound this intimidating, it is a little bit of a letdown to see them be able to be taken out so quickly. And then the last new enemy that they added into this particular season is actually linked to the new seasonal event, which is the Core Stone and their Core Stone Crawlers. So talking about the Core Stone event on its own for right now, this is my favorite seasonal event that they have made for the game to date. It is a phenomenal seasonal event to go through. From a cinematic and cool factor, it is just very well done. The way that they designed this particular seasonal event from a visual standpoint is just out of the park. It really feels very alien, very different than things that we have seen before in many different ways. When the Core Stone gets released and it just creates those portals that open up into wherever they're going, and you just see the crawlers pouring out while these big ominous sounds are happening, it's just absolutely insane to go through. The amount of chaos and hecticness that surrounds this particular seasonal event, I personally really enjoy. It's one of those seasonal events that you kind of have to sort of lock in a little bit for and take a bit seriously. Now, I will say, talking about the Core Spawn Crawler themselves, a lot of people have pointed to the fact that they are pretty durable for how small and fast they are, and that definitely is true to a good extent. These things have armor on them, which alone is a pretty strong fact, but they can also hit pretty hard and are incredibly quick. Not to mention the fact that when you take them out, they leave behind pools of acid that you can't step in or else you take damage. So all of those things together point to these things being pretty darn durable and strong, and the amount of them that you have to fight when doing this particular event can sometimes make it feel a little bit overwhelming, which is why I said before that you kind of need to lock in and prepare yourself to do this particular event if you do want to get through it. Now, there are ways that you can make it easier. I know the Gunner specifically is a very strong asset for these particular seasonal events, because if you set up the zip lines properly, the crawlers essentially can't get to you. And I know this was a case before. I don't know if they've patched it out yet, but I know that there was a bug where if you put an energy shield on top of the crystal and then broke it, the core stone would just immediately be destroyed and you would just be able to complete the event instantly. I don't know if that's been patched out just yet, but ultimately that just made the gunner very valuable because you wanted to have him on the team basically at all times in case you did come across a core stone event, and he essentially made it very trivial. But even if you do have to go through the core stone event normally, it's really not that bad even without the gunner using his cheese techniques. I've done it several times myself and it is possible. But I will say one thing that I think would not really be too big of an issue for some people is to maybe just tone down the durability of the core stone crawlers themselves, or maybe make them just a little bit slower. They are very oppressive, especially once you get onto the higher hazard levels, to where a team that is even a little bit unorganized is going to have a hard time dealing with this. But again, from a visual and design and style perspective, this seasonal event is a home run and I very much enjoy it. From a difficulty and gameplay standpoint, it might have a couple of kinks depending on what gameplay or style you are using, and it could probably do with a couple of tweaks to the crawlers themselves, like I said, but other than that, it is a phenomenal seasonal event. Then the next thing that has come out with this particular season, and is probably the biggest thing for a lot of people, are the new overclocks added to each of the primary weapons. Overclocks are the things that people enjoy the most, for the most part, because it gives them significantly more unique ways to outfit themselves. These new overclocks added are, for the most part, incredible. There's a couple of key exceptions to this. I know a lot of people are a little bit underwhelmed by the Scouts overclocks, not necessarily because they're bad in most cases, but because they are very specific. The GK2 one is probably the most underwhelming out of all of them. In terms of idea, I like where they were going for with the burst fire, but it really does feel like the GK2 loses a lot of power when you use it. And then the Marked for Death for the M1000 and the Conductive Thermals for the Drac are both really good overclocks when you're in a team-based environment, or if you just have a very specific build to complement them yourself, but they do fall off significantly when you don't have teammates to capitalize off of them. Now, I'm okay with this because I love the idea of having team-based overclocks that really want you to have a really well put together and organized team. And I know a lot of the main criticism are coming from players who just prefer to play solo or prefer to play with just people that they don't have proper communication or organization with, which is fine. But that doesn't change the fact that these particular overclocks, for the most part, are incredibly effective. For the Marked for Death specifically, I've seen some crazy setups where dreadnoughts have basically been eliminated very quickly using both it and things like the Conductive Thermals as well. And for the other classes, the overclocks have basically been a home run. The Drillers overclocks, the Scorching Tide, the Crystal Nucleation, and the Combustive Goo Mix are all really, really well done and kind of help him lean into his elemental builds a lot more. The Gunner specifically with his Rotary Overdrive, which is probably my new favorite overclock for him specifically. The mortar rounds are just insanely fun to use, and the cluster charges just let you blow up the entire map. And then the Engineer with the Smart Trigger OS makes the Smart Rifle significantly more user-friendly, at least in my opinion. The Hyperalloy assembly for his SMG is a little bit underwhelming, but it's kind of made up with the fact that his reworked overclock for the Stubby is insanely good, and the pump action has just been an absolute dream of mine to use, and it is just phenomenal. And I think the overclocks that aren't performing as well as people would like can very easily be changed or tweaked or updated at some point in time to where they fit a more specific role. And across the board, I think that these new overclocks have just been probably the best thing that have come with this particular season, aside from the new mission type, in terms of evergreen content that is going to keep people enjoyed with the game for a long time, because as they add new overclocks and new mission types and new enemies of the sort, these sorts of things will evolve to the point where they'll be seeing what future combinations will work even beyond this season. So moving on, we have something that I actually have not had a whole lot of experience with since the season first came out, which is the new warnings and anomalies. We got 2 new warnings and 2 new anomalies with this season to help mix up missions. Duck and Cover, which makes it so that way significantly more ranged enemies show up during the actual mission. I have experienced this one a couple of times, and I will say it does make the missions a lot harder. You see things like more Mactera, more Spitters, more Web Spitters, more Septic Spreaders. It can make the missions significantly more difficult, especially depending on the mission type that you're on. This on something like a Industrial Sabotage or even a Salvage Operation or even the new Deep Scan mission types can be very problematic because you're essentially sitting duck in a lot of those circumstances. So this is definitely one that has hit a lot of players hard, no pun intended. And while I don't think it necessarily needs any form of nerfing in a specific sense, And I do know that they have adjusted this particular warning a couple of times to change the spawning rate of certain enemies, but ultimately this is probably the most powerful out of all of the particular new hazards and anomalies that they have added. And then they also added Ebonite Outbreak, which just makes it so that way Ebonite grunts will be seen in the normal crowd of enemies, and Molly will occasionally dispense the overcharged batteries that you can use to take them out. I haven't really seen this one a whole lot. I've only done this one maybe 2 or 3 times since the season first came out, and it really didn't feel like it was that detrimental to have those extra enemies included in the swarms. It kind of made it so that way you just had to change your playstyle just a little bit, because it's not like they were showing up all the time, and if you just made sure to stay close to Molly, it really wasn't that big of a deal. And then when it comes to the anomalies, Secret Secondary is very straightforward. It just gives you an extra secondary objective, so there's really nothing problematic about that one. It just gives you a higher payout, unless the only real thing I can think is just it makes the missions longer. So if you like fast missions, you might not like this one a whole lot, but then at the same time, you don't really need to do the secondary objectives if you don't want to anyway. So, and then blood sugar is a very interesting anomaly. I've used this one a handful of times, and the effects of this one can vary greatly depending on the mission situation. In certain situations and with certain other factors at play, this can be a phenomenal anomaly that will basically keep you alive infinitely and will help you survive greatly against certain threats. In other situations, it can honestly feel more like a warning because you just won't be able to heal through the constant loss of health. If you're on something like a point extraction mission type, where enemies are constantly coming at you, then it's really not that big of a deal because you essentially have a very steady supply of red sugar that's going to drop off. But if you're in certain other mission types, this thing is just straight up problematic. If you're on just something like an elimination mission where not a lot of smaller enemies spawn anyway and you're just dealing with the dreadnoughts, this can be very problematic because you just won't have enough constant ways to heal yourself. Now granted, there are ways that you can capitalize on this. For example, if you're running a double warning mission and you have this plus Swarmageddon, you basically never have to worry about it. Or if you find a Brood Nexus, you can essentially turn it into a constant red sugar mine, which is fine, but if you're not in those particular circumstances, this can almost feel like a warning instead of an anomaly. Again, while I haven't had a crazy amount of experience with this particular anomaly, it does feel like it just matters significantly about what the rest of the mission circumstances are, whether this is going to be really good or really, really bad. In total, with all of these different new mutators, I think that they changed the mission types in varying degrees to a good extent. Some of them I do think need to be tweaked a little bit, like Duck and Cover and Blood Sugar to be specific. And overall, I'm very happy that they're here and that we have new ways to go through missions with interesting little twists. I do think there does need to be a little bit of tweaking, however. So next up, we have the addition of a new difficulty level, which is Haz 5+, which admittedly I don't have a crazy amount of experience with myself. Basically, this is a further difficulty past Hazard Level 5 that gives you the ability to adjust enemy behavior such as their aggression level, the number of enemies, how tough they are, and how vulnerable you are, which is basically how much damage you take. For the people who like to push themselves and go even further, this is a great thing because it just gives you another way to give yourself some challenge, especially for the console community, because the PC community obviously has ways to mod the game to give themselves much higher hazards levels than even this. But for the console community, this is a very good thing because it allows them to get even more challenge out of the game. And while I don't claim myself to be a hardcore Haz 5 enjoyer myself, I do think that it is very nice to have those kinds of high octane, high difficulty ways to push yourselves as high as you can. And overall, I think this is just a good thing for them to implement because it's just another way that players can push themselves. And then some of the more smaller things that came out with this particular season, some of them being smaller than others. First, with the new ability to switch back and forth between pre-existing seasons. This is a great thing because the more and more people who get into this game, the harder it is for them to get things, especially if they miss out on certain seasons. So giving them the ability to go back and do things that they missed is phenomenal. It also means that the loot pool is significantly less bloated with less filler that you just don't want to have. And while I haven't personally gone back to any old seasons yet because I'm still not done with the Season 5 pass, the fact that I have the option to do that at any point in time and to be able to go back to my favorite season of all time, which is Season 3, just kidding, it's actually Season 1, is a good thing that a lot of players can take advantage of if they want to either go back to play their favorite season, or if they just never got the chance to finish the pass from that particular season, they can do that. And then the new smaller things like the cosmetic filtering, the reworked status effect overlays, smaller things like that aren't necessarily that big of a deal, but are just nice things to have. Same thing with like the new promotion tracker, so you can see just how much somebody has played the game. So to sum up basically everything that I have been talking about and give my at least initial early verdict onto how Season 5 is doing, I think that it is performing very, very well, especially when compared to Season 4. But even compared to every other season, I think it's still doing great. And at this point, it might overtake Season 1 as my favorite season so far. I think that the mission type is a hit. I think the enemies, for the most part, are pretty good without being too oppressive. The Overclocks add a big degree of customization that players obviously really love. The Mutators are a little bit odd, and some of them could use a little bit of tweaking, but for the most part, I think that changes to the gameplay is always a good thing. The new difficulty level is a great way for players to push themselves, and the plethora of quality of life and improvement fixes that we have gotten just help to really make the game feel like it is pushing in a forward direction, and also does help us understand what could happen when Rogue Core does eventually come out. Because keep in mind that this whole entire season is basically a prelude or a prologue to Rogue Core, and has a lot of those aspects and factors brought into it. So the things that we have seen so far with Season 5 are just going to be amplified that further once Rogue Core comes out. So those are my thoughts as to where Season 5 is standing right now, and it is pretty good. But I want to know what you guys have to say. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments or in the Discord channel. Do you guys like where Season 5 is at? Do you think anything should be changed? Do you think it's better or worse than Season 4 or any of the other seasons? Let me know what your favorite season is down in the comments as well, because I would love to hear it. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, be sure to give it a like, because it tells me what types of videos you guys want to see. And consider becoming a member today, as it really helps me out a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, see you in the next video.